Today is part 2 of our interview with Brent Adamson. Most of us are solving sales and marketing problems, but instead, we need to focus on solving customer buying problems. Why? Because buying is harder today than it's ever been, and you need to think what it feels like from your customer's perspective and experience. We're going to talk about new research on empathy and solving buying problems. So stick with us. Helping people see things from the customer's point of view. And in your book, The Challenger Customer, you talked about the most powerful principle. Sitting at the core of the book is empathy. And I just wanted to ask you about that because we spent some time talking together a few months ago. But why is that? Why is that the most important principle sitting at the core?
Well, by the way, this is the idea that empathy is the sort of the core principle of the entire book. The Challenger Customer is, I would admit, is more of a personal opinion than sort of based on all of our research. But it is, and you'll notice, I think I told you this, Brian. The word doesn't actually appear anywhere in the proper book. It's only in the acknowledgments where I made just a little blurb in the very back, a little note to my daughters, and I used the word empathy there. But in fact, in many ways, for me personally, that one word captures everything that the book is about. And I know this is a topic not only is near and dear to your heart, but something your expertise here is far deeper than mine. But when I think of empathy, I think of kind of two components to it. And it'd be interesting, Brian, to get your thoughts on this. Actually, you can make me smarter on this. But it's almost like a right brain, left brain, or rational versus emotional. I don't know what the right way to think about it is. But empathy, from my perspective, and I've looked at lots of different definitions and seen alternate ways to think about it. But empathy is, at a very basic level, your ability to place yourself in someone else's shoes and see the world from their perspective. And that might be sort of logically how they view the world from their perspective, or it might be emotionally what the world feels like from their perspective. And I find both of those attributes of empathy to be potentially hugely powerful for anyone in sales or marketing. So just to give you a couple different examples, I've got 3 or 4 of them here in front of me. We can go into any of them in some depth if you'd like, Brian. But one is, for example, whenever we're talking about customer improvement or even the broader work in Challenger, in fact, we wrote the whole chapter in the Challenger Customer on this idea, is this idea of mental modeling, right? So the whole idea being, if you're going to change the way a customer thinks about their business, what's the first thing you have to understand more than anything else? How would you answer that, Brian?
Well, if I were to do that, I'd need to understand what their experience is, and how they see things.
You got it. See, and this is why it's fun talking to you, because you get this stuff, right? And I see this great hopefully empathy and respect for everyone out there. What I find when I ask most leaders, sales and commercial marketing leaders, that question, which is this: if you're going to change the way a customer thinks about their business, what's the first thing you have to understand? Virtually everyone will say, well, their business. And in fact, and so then they start, reading 10Ks and 10Qs for, the annual reports and the financials and all that kind of stuff. And what I find is actually what we found in our research is actually closer into where you are, which is if you're going to change the way a customer thinks about their business, the first thing you have to understand is how they think about their business. Because that's the thing you've got to change. Not their business per se, but their thinking of their business. And so to get there, we find it can be very productive to actually draw a map, if you will, on a piece of paper, a map to their thinking. What is it? We call this a mental model. There's mental mapping is another term for this idea, but the idea is if you can simply draw with a couple boxes and some connecting lines, sort of what is their goal, what is their objective as an organization, what do they believe to be the primary challenges, or if you will, the primary drivers of achieving that goal, what are the secondary challenges or the secondary drivers for each of those, and you can map it out. You can actually draw on a piece of paper. We do this in all of our research here. We build mental models for heads of sales and mental models for heads of marketing all the time. It's actually how we do our research. But there's nothing to say that heads of marketing or marketing teams, sales teams couldn't do the same thing for their customers, which is just simply put on paper a very simple diagram. Don't overcomplicate it. Few boxes, couple lines of here's their core objective as an organization, what they're trying to achieve, how they think they're going to get there, so the challenges they think are going to be are going to get in the way, or the levers they need to pull to make that happen, whichever perspective you want. And then once you've got that mental model, you can put it in front of the customer and say, did I get it right? What would you add? What would you take away? If I give you 100 pennies to distribute across these 10 boxes according to priority, how would you distribute them? You can build it out. When you're all done, what you have on a piece of paper is a picture of how the customer thinks about their business. And so now when you think, well, if you're going to change the way a customer thinks about their business, first thing you need to understand is how they think about their business. Now you've got it on a piece of paper. Now what you can do is you can step back and look at it and say, well, what'd they miss? Which box should be bigger? Which one should be smaller? Which one's not here at all but needs to be? Which connective arrow needs to go from this box to that one instead of this one to only that one? And you can begin to look for opportunities to challenge their thinking, to help them improve their thinking, to make them smarter about what they're doing. But that only works by having that mental model to begin with, which I would argue, at least from a logical perspective, is at least a form of empathy, because that's what that model is. It's a picture of the world from their perspective. It's seeing the world from your customer's perspective. And that doesn't have the emotional component that some aspects of empathy have, which we could talk about as well. But I don't. So let me just stop and ask you, Brian. Does that count as empathy in your perspective, or is that outside the bounds of how you define the term?
Oh, it does. I think it's the two levels you just touched on. It's the perspective taking, so understanding how they see their business, and then the second thing is the emotional side. And so neuroscientist Antonio Damasio said we aren't thinking machines that feel, we're feeling machines that think. And so what he argued is we make emotional decisions rationally. So we need to take both perspectives to understand.
Well, what's really interesting too is that because you can build in the emotional side to this in all sorts of interesting ways. Because people will ask us all the time, so about this mental model, Brent, do I need one for each of the many different stakeholders involved in a purchase? Do I have one per company, one per person? How does that work? What we find, just practically speaking, just to make this a little bit easier to do, is just have one mental model for a company. And what you're going to find over time is that these mental models are highly scalable, that in fact one mental model can apply to an entire industry vertical, sometimes the entire customer base, depending on how you go to market and where you do that. But nonetheless, what you will find is that different customer stakeholders inside a customer organization are going to prioritize different boxes on the mental model in different ways. Some are going to think if you give them all 100 pennies and ask them to distribute them according to priority, they're going to potentially distribute them in different ways. Now, imagine a world where you are talking to one of those stakeholders and that individual has to get consensus across the other 4 or 5 to make that deal happen. And this is all implicit. It's not explicit, but from their mind, they kind of have that mental model in their map, right? It's like, well, I care about this box, he cares about that box. They may be not thinking about boxes per se, but it's all sort of there. And then you think, and one of the things we know from our research is what we also all know to be true as just individual professionals, right? Which is going down the hall and convincing your colleagues to do anything differently is kind of a pain. And sometimes it's a really pain. Sometimes it's kind of scary. Sometimes it's a little intimidating. What we find is that the greater, the larger the buying group, the more individual stakeholders feel not only their credibility, but in fact their actual job to be on the line in going and advocating for a particular supplier. And that gets into the emotional side of empathy, right? So you think about from a supplier's perspective, we think, well, why can't they all just get on board? It's like herding cats, and I can't get these people to align. Well, you can't get them to align because think about what it feels like. Think about that person sitting at their desk. I always call this the Thursday morning 9 o'clock test, right? It's Thursday morning, 9 o'clock. And you've got to do what? What are you going to do, and how is that going to feel? And so I'm thinking about buying your cool CRM solution, and it's Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, and I'm thinking in order to get my company to buy that solution, which I really want, I've got to go talk to someone in IT, I've got to go talk to someone in procurement, I've got to go talk to my CEO. You know what? I feel kind of sick to my stomach. I don't want to do that. It's a pain in my neck. And all of a sudden, what seems to be a slam dunk because this person I'm talking to loves it is completely in danger because that person doesn't feel like going talk to those other people. So that becomes a hugely important part of empathy too. Is what am I asking my senior decision maker, my contact person? What am I asking them to go do inside their own company? What does that feel like? And chances are pretty good it doesn't feel very good. It's hard work. It's credibility. It's business case building. They're going to ask me questions. All those questions your sales reps have all the time. What if they ask me questions I can't answer? What if they ask for data that I don't know how to provide? You know what? Your stakeholders you're selling to have the exact same questions when they think about their own colleagues. What if my head of IT wants a business case? I don't know where I'm going to get that. He's going to ask me a bunch of questions I don't know how to answer. Look, I just want this bleep and bleep CRM system, but this is too hard. Never mind. And being able to place yourself in the shoes of that stakeholder and understand what it feels like for them not to. We always think about what it feels like to sell our solutions, but think about what it feels like to buy one of your solutions, and it rarely feels good.
I really appreciate you just sharing your perspective because this is really hard work even for us as sellers to look at because we spend so much time focused on how are we going to get the deal done instead of understanding from our customers, well, how do we help them get the deal done, and navigate all the things they need to do to mobilize the support to make it happen.
We have an article in the Harvard Business Review in the March issue of 2017. So of course on HBR.com and other places too. It's called the New Sales Imperative, and the New Sales Imperative is the idea behind it is exactly what you're talking about. Which, by the way, it's called the New Sales Imperative because they find that if they put the word sales in the title, it sells more issues, so they like that. But this is much the new marketing initiative imperative as well. That was somewhat tongue in cheek, but it's actually true. That is, as a supplier. What we find is that the single hardest thing about solutions today is not selling them. It is, in fact, buying them. And if you go out and you talk to, I've talked to literally thousands, all the retreats and meetings and conferences we do. I did this with 1,200 people at our Vegas conference last year. I simply asked them to, take your selling hat off and put your buying hat on and think about your own organization and think about, a recent big complex solution that you purchased with your colleagues at your company in the last 18 months, whether it's a CRM system or some sort of lead management system or an IT system or a consulting engagement, whatever it is. And I said, think about all the people involved, all the decisions you had to make, all the sort of hoops you had to jump through. And I said, now if you had to pick one word and one adjective to describe that entire buying journey, what would that be? And like I said, I've done this with thousands of people around the world, and inevitably, what do you think the words are, Brian? Take a guess.
I'm not even sure.
Maybe things like long, hard, awful, frustrating. They get actually, it's really interesting when you ask people to place themselves in their own purchase journey and just ask them to share one word, they get kind of angry. It's really interesting. You could see their tension, right? And it's like the cuss words start coming out in like ways that are not really appropriate for meetings that I was conducting. And I'll never forget, someone in Chicago, as a head of marketing in Chicago, said, I never want to do that again. Like it was one word, because I asked for one word. So I never want to do that again. So one word. And someone in D.C. said landmine. I said, that's not an adjective. And he said landmine-ish, which became my word for the year. But right. The point of all this being, if you put yourself in the shoes of your customer and ask them, what does it feel like to buy a solution? I literally have heard out of the thousands of people I've asked, I'm not kidding, I've literally heard 3 positive words out of thousands and thousands of people I've talked to. It's all negative. And then you ask them a second question, which is really interesting, Brian. You ask them, all right, so how much of that pain, how much of that time, how much of that frustration was the result of the supplier selling to you, and how much of it was just the result of your own company getting in its own way? And 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, people will say it had nothing to do with the supplier selling to me. It's just my own company. Because we all are convinced our own company is the worst company in the world, right? We're just getting our own way. We're too complicated. We have too many meetings, on and on.
Right.
And what's really interesting is, that what we have here is not a selling problem at all. Is what we have is a buying problem, and buying is really bleeping hard with all the committees and all the information, all the options. It all just it becomes completely overwhelming. And again, back to the point about empathy, if you can understand this as a seller, as a marketer, it doesn't matter which, and you can understand just how hard it is to buy not just your solution, but just any solution, to filter all their information, to figure out which information matters most, to go through all the options, determine which options matter most, to kind of wrangle all the different people and figure out all the different questions they're going to have. And you can anticipate, this is empathy, right? If you know what that feels like, and then logically you can anticipate what those problems are going to be and which information is going to matter most, you can effectively become the coach to your customer, not on what to buy, but on how to buy. You can take them by the hand and you can guide them through that buying journey and become sort of that buying sherpa, and not solve for selling, but solve for buying. And that's what a lot of our more recent work has been about, is this adopting what we've come to call a prescriptive approach to selling. And again, we've seen marketing organizations do this really well through content that is self-serving, to that yes. Customers can self-serve on. So I can go to my Google search, will take me to a white paper that a company's written, which will take me step by step. Looking to buy CRM? Here's the 10-step process. First, do this. Talk to these people. Here's the information matters. This question doesn't matter. And from a customer's perspective, the reaction is not, I see you're trying to trick me into buying your stuff, but rather the reaction is, wow, this was really helpful. You just made it so much easier. And you can only do that, in my mind, effectively as a supplier if you come at this whole idea with empathy, of being able to understand what it feels like to buy, because it doesn't feel very good.
Well, in what you shared, it's a lot of us treat the journey, and we're going to talk a bit about your marketing research in a moment, but we treat the journey as this beautiful looking linear model that moves from left to right, and it's a nice flow, and it's really like climbing a mountain to our customer. And so I love the word picture of being a Sherpa, because Sherpas are there to help help people climb, help them along the journey. And so that's really, I think, the whole idea of empathy. It's applied empathy because our goal is really to help people on their journey.
Totally agree. Now, I mean, let's not forget that at the end of the day, we're all in the business of doing one thing, which is selling more stuff, right? So, so empathy is all well and good, and it is. Actually, it's so powerful that the cynic in someone listening today might say, well, this is just empathy for the sake of selling more stuff. And to some degree, you know what? That's true, because that's what we're solving for in the world of sales and marketing. But that doesn't mean it's less powerful, any less honorable, or it's helping customers find ways to generate greater value for their business they haven't seen them, or they haven't appreciated on their own, and in navigating them to a place, or helping them navigate themselves to a place where they can actually realize that value. And I think in many ways it's not only an honorable thing to do, it's a, you know, for your customer, it's what we find is it's a very profitable thing for you to do as a supplier as well.
Well, and I 100% agree. I mean, at the base level, practicing this way, marketing and sales can and should be a force for good. And so as you're talking, you know, about this, I wanted to shift about the marketing research, because you had some really interesting findings just around the journey of the customer. And what surprised you about the B2B buyer journey, and also the most important channels customers are using?
Well, to back up, one of the things that we're studying this year in our marketing practice is simply just digital, right? So we got a little more specific than that, but you can imagine, particularly in B2B marketing, B2C marketing, digital has been a huge part, if not the primary part of buying for a long time now. But it has become equally important in B2B very rapidly over the last several years, and not surprisingly, we're getting questions around the world from the CMOs that we work with, the hundreds of them, around how do we move to become a more digitally proficient marketing organization? What does that even mean? What would be the characteristics, the hallmarks? And so we set out to understand at least some of this world of digital buying in the B2B space with more detail this year, so we could provide our members with greater, more actionable advice. And one of the ways we started was just trying to understand what does the digital buying journey look like in B2B? What we really trying to understand is what does the buying journey look like in B2B, and then effectively along that buying journey, which parts are most likely to be digital. And along the way, we found something that's actually really interesting, because what you find with most marketers, and I mean this with deep respect, is just the result of just the way we all kind of came up and the way that digital came into our worlds, and the way that marketing's always operated. We tend to think of digital in marketing as a tool for demand generation. That is largely upper funnel to maybe mid funnel capability, and the idea is that we use digital, whether it be websites, whether it be online conferences or discussion boards or advertising and SEO, you name it, all of it, right? It's largely a way to create and or identify opportunities / customers that we then vet through maybe digitally based lead nurturing campaigns, and at some point we deem them marketing qualified, we put the stamp of approval on them, and we pass them over to sales, and we say, all right, go get them, guys. And at that point forward, it becomes largely an in-person sales rep calling them, you know, phone, in-person, trying to close that deal. And from our perspective in marketing, it's like, okay, we got them that far, it's on you guys, go get them, right? What we've come to understand through our research this year, and understanding, when you go out and you research customers, what you find, perhaps not surprisingly really, is that just because a customer's in-person buying journey has begun, that is, just because they've at some point, whether it's at 57%, that number we talk about all the time, at some point during the purchase journey, they will pick up the phone or fire up the email and reach out to a direct, an actual sales rep and have in-person communications, whether it's in-person, over the phone, you name it. But just because that point has occurred, wherever it occurs, doesn't mean that their digital buying journey has come to an end. It's not like, you know, digital in the up funnel and in-person on the down funnel. Rather, it's the two coexist. And part of our research is, it turns out, is an individual salesperson you can get in earlier too. But the thing that I think is especially interesting and new for us this year is how much of the buying behavior is still in digital channels, even late in a purchase. Often long after we in the marketing organization have kind of handed it off and said, go get them sales, our customers are still online learning. There's still late stage digital buying activity. And that's got a number of really interesting implications from our perspective. Because you think about sort of, are we even thinking about that, right? So from a marketing perspective, is it largely demand gen and then digital is done? Well, if it's late stage, what's actually happening? And as we dug into our research, what we find is, for example, one of the things that your customers are really looking for through digital channels in a late stage, later in a purchase process, is reassurance. They're looking to make sure that so I'm talking to talking to Brent, the sales rep, and Brent's making all sorts of promises, and he's convinced me to buy this multi-million-dollar solution, which is great, and I trust him. He's not a crook, right? But nonetheless, one way or another, this thing's big, it's disruptive, it's expensive. I'd kind of like to get some reassurance. I'd like to maybe see what other customers have experienced in buying the solution, or so irrespective of my ongoing in-person conversations with that sales rep, I'm going to go out and corroborate what I'm learning there, and maybe add to it through digital channels. And one of the channels, and I find this absolutely fascinating, and maybe Brian, you can help me understand this. One of the things we found in surveying customers this year is the most likely place for them to go to get that late stage digital reassurance is the supplier's own website, which I find kind of ironic. It's like, I'm not sure if I completely trust the sales rep, so I'll go to the company's website to get reassurance. But nonetheless, that's what happens, which begs a really interesting question, which is when they go to your website to get reassurance on what they're hearing from your rep, are they even going to find that reassurance, and is that reassurance going to be consistent with what the rep has said in person? Because if they're not aligned, you are going to raise all sorts of red flags for that customer. And so let me take a breath there. But these are some of the things, because the implications here are fascinating. But I would imagine that rings true so far. So it's kind of what I shared. Does that make sense?
It does. As I was listening to you, and something you touched on is marketing. We've always had this traditional handoff from a marketing qualified lead to sales. And so what you're saying is that we need to actually go beyond, handoff and think about the whole journey. And so what can marketers do differently based on your research? Because there is this gap right now, and buyers are going back to the website to get this reassurance, and marketers have this gap that they filling right now from what your research is showing.
Well, it's funny. I always tell people the cool thing about doing research is every time you do a large-scale research project, you always inevitably find two things. You find answers, which is great, but you always get more questions, which is, I suppose, good because it keeps us in business, right? But there's all sorts of questions here, right? If digital doesn't work as a handoff, but rather as an ongoing effort, to your point, Brian, that raises all sorts of questions. What should not just marketing do, but sales do, and commercial leaders? Because what you have here now, at least what we really can see clearly in our data for the first time in data, is sort of what we've watched happen, and certainly in the business-to-consumer world for 5-10 years. Effectively, what you have here is a very clear picture of omni-channel buying, right? So that your customers are gathering information, they're engaged in a purchase process through multiple channels simultaneously, whether it's digital, whether it's website, whether it's SEO, whether it's in person through sales reps, and all that's happening simultaneously. And so it isn't this like early on digital, later on person, but rather all the time, always on digital, person, and lots of other different channels. And so what it means is we've got to coordinate across these channels in a much more effective manner than we have in the past. And so, by the way, the thing that's so interesting about omnichannel and B2C is interesting enough, right? Because that means how do I get all of my digital teams in marketing to collaborate more effectively? So I got social, I've got search, I've got TV advertising. That would be the consumer world. Now I got to get I got to get my TV team and my agency partner, my online people, my social, my Facebook team. They all got to coordinate. What's interesting is once you move omnichannel buying from the B2C world to the B2B world, it gets 1,000 times more complicated, because now omnichannel means that we don't just have to span teams within the marketing function, but rather we have to span functions altogether, right? So that the alignment isn't just this team and this team in marketing, but it's actually the entire marketing function has to be aligned with the sales function in some ways that, frankly, we've just never really fully appreciated before, because we're always solving for marketing or selling as opposed to solving for buying. And so some of the questions this raises for us would be things like, how does one just do this? How do you overcome the decades of institutional inertia? And we've all been complaining about the lack of sales and marketing integration I've been doing this for 15 years. One of the first things I heard on my first day of work when I joined CEB many years ago was, why can't sales and marketing just figure out how to collaborate? And now when you solve for buying, you find the urgency has gone up dramatically, because again, if I'm hearing one thing from my sales rep and I'm finding a different thing on your website, that's going to at the very least raise questions in a world where you're trying to get me to change behavior, which is, remember, is risky. And if I see anything that makes me a little bit more nervous, at the very least it's going to slow me down, if not shut me down. And so now you've got to get all these different pieces inside a marketing and sales organization aligned, so that you got one message to the customer and it's always consistent, so your customer can go on whatever buying journey they want, whether it's digital and different kinds of digital, whether it's in person, and no matter which path I choose, I'm going to get a consistent message. Because if they're not, it's going to slow things down. And that to me is really fascinating. And that's so we're trying to figure out right now, like, what practically, tactically What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what has to be aligned? How do I do that? And I think the answer here, I think for us, is TBD, and that's like that's what we're on right now. It's like we need to figure this kind of stuff out. It raises all sorts of interesting questions, even structurally.
Yes.
Like, would it be better if sales and marketing is reported into a single person? I think what we're finding already, even very anecdotally, is that those organizations where sales and marketing report up into a single person are just more likely to succeed in this environment for all the reasons I just mentioned.
And I'd like to try something out on you. I'm actually writing a post about this, but as I've thought about this idea of empathy and how do we support the journey, I think it's really moving from this campaign mindset from campaigns to conversations. And says we're thinking about this. How can we have a more congruent conversation with our customer as they go through their journey? So in effect, we're helping them. And I think the best marketing and selling feels like helping because it really is, and so I like this idea you talked about, one message. I think it's it's a conversation, is bi-directional. And so I think if we can be more congruent in the conversation, or really the principle of what I'm saying is when we're more congruent, it changes the conversation so it can be more reciprocal with our potential customer.
More reciprocal and also more efficient, right? Because one of the things we find about sales cycle times, of course, they've gone up dramatically, and it takes longer to sell, partly because it takes longer for customers to buy. And again, to your point, if they're finding incongruent signals across the different channels from which they are gathering information, that's going to slow things down that much more. The challenge here, and again, we're still trying to figure this out, but the word you used I like, Brian, is the word conversation. But notice just the word, but in this context, you have to look at it not literally but metaphorically, right? Because a conversation is a human interaction, right? It's people talking to people and conversing with one another. And so that takes us right back to 10 years ago, where I've got to have a sales rep involved. I've got to train my sales reps to have better conversations. And that is absolutely true, but this is more conversation in the metaphorical sense, which is it's not only an actual real conversation between these two human beings, but it's also a quote-unquote conversation between our company's website and that customer, or through these third-party influencers and our customer. And so that broader view of the overall conversation and managing that becomes the thing that we have. That's the bogey we got to focus on. As opposed to just this actual literal conversation, which is only going to be a small part of it. But nonetheless, if you ask any head of sales, they'll tell you that's it. It's all that, and we have to solve for that. And that's not the case anymore. It's a way too limited perspective, I think.
And as I was thinking and listening to you, I mean, our customers see our websites personified. They put a human context to the brand, to the company, to even the language that's being used. And so I think the metaphor, that's really what I'm talking about, and I'm glad you articulated it that way, is this metaphor of a conversation instead of the traditional campaign, which is more mono. And what I'm saying is be bi-directional. And I
think that's right. And by the way, going back to our empathy point, so now you can actually start asking really interesting questions with the metaphor of a conversation that you can get in. So imagine you go to a party and you're involved in so what makes for a good conversation? What makes for a bad conversation? How does it feel to be involved in a bad conversation? How like you go to a party and you're in a conversation for whatever reason, it's like, and you just feel awkward and you just like want to go crawl under a rock, or you want to go away, or you honestly just want it to end, right? It's like that's what it feels like from a customer's perspective when they're engaged with a conversation with your company that isn't going according to expectations, or is sending mixed messages. And ask yourself, are we doing that to our customer? How do we make our customers feel as a conversation partner? It would be a really interesting thing to explore.
Research on how do you improve being a good conversationalist. It's actually, instead of trying to be interesting, be interested in the person you're talking with. And that in and of itself is, I just find so much of what we do as marketers and sellers, it's all about us. And we need to spend more time. It's really all about them. And
one of the best piece of advice I ever got in a conversation was, get the other person talking about themselves.
Totally.
But yeah, that's way too simplistic, but it is in the ballpark of what you're talking about, which is so much better articulated. I think that's absolutely right. This stuff gets so interesting when you start solving for buying problems as opposed to selling or marketing problems. And again, I think that's where this idea of empathy at a very high level comes in, take your selling hat off, take your marketing hat off, and just ask yourself, what does it feel like to buy? How hard is it? What's hard about it? Why would I not do it? Why would I choose to opt out of it? What would have to happen for me to think it was easier? What would have to happen for me to feel more urgency or more excitement around it? Solve for buying as opposed to solve for selling or marketing, and I think you're going to be just significantly better off relative to your competition.
Brent, I think that's a perfect wrap to our conversation today. As I was just thinking about, well, what can we do? I think you just gave us the questions of what can we do to improve our focus and our efforts. So what's the best way for readers or listeners to get in touch with you and keep up with your research?
There's a couple of different channels. So we post some of our videos and things on YouTube. Sometimes just searching my name, Brent Adamson, will come up with a couple there. But most importantly, where we'd love to have anyone interested in our work, a couple different ways you can find us. Probably the most logical place would go to be cebglobal.com. That's our main website, and we'll take you into not just the CEB world, but now the Gartner world too, which is very cool, and lots of new capabilities. So cebglobal.com. And then we have a website for each book, and that will tell you more about the research behind the book, tell you where to find it, and then also channel you back to us. So there's challengersale.com and challengercustomer.com, or if you like, thechallengersale.com and thechallengercustomer.com, either one will work. So there's a couple ways to find us, and me personally, I'm on LinkedIn, and we all have our phones tattooed onto our arms or whatever. You find me on LinkedIn, I'm pretty responsive because I sleep with my phone under my pillow. I'm that guy. So we're always happy to talk to commercial leaders and just because we all learn together. And I think that's honest to goodness truth of what's kept me doing this at this company for so many years, Brian, is that it truly is a collaborative learning exercise, a learning journey that we're all going on where we get smarter together. And I think that's pretty cool.
Thanks for joining us today, Brent. Really appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely, Brian. Cheers. And let's do it again soon.
For additional show notes and information, you can go to b2bleadblog.com, download the articles that Brent spoke about in today's interview, as well as get links to follow-up research as well. Thank you again.